By late war, German planners confronted a distance problem that maps could not soften. Across the Atlantic lay cities untouched by sirens, industries beyond reach, and an enemy whose confidence rested on geography. In workshops and briefing rooms, attention turned to aircraft that looked unfinished, oversized, or impractical, yet promised reach rather than elegance. The project gathered around a long-range bomber concept built from existing components, stretched beyond normal limits, and asked to fly farther than doctrine allowed. Its logic was austere: endurance over protection, navigation over speed, psychological effect over tonnage. Tests suggested that ocean could be crossed, that landfall could be approached, and that return might be possible under narrow conditions. Rumors moved faster than metal. Allied intelligence reacted not to photographs alone, but to the implication that distance itself was no longer a shield. The aircraft never became a weapon in the conventional sense. It remained a possibility, a calculation, a threat defined by what it might force the enemy to consider. In an air war measured by production and attrition, this machine mattered because it shifted attention from battles to horizons, from destruction to uncertainty, and from immediate damage to the fear of precedent alone today. The airfield is quiet in a way that suggests intention rather than neglect. It is active but restrained. Engines are absent from the soundscape and voices are kept low, as if volume itself might attract attention. Ground crews move with practiced efficiency, yet they avoid standing back to take in the aircraft as a whole. They work close, focused on panels, lines, and fittings, treating it as a collection of tasks rather than a single object. From a distance, the aircraft does not resemble the bombers already familiar to the war. Its proportions feel unresolved. The wings extend farther than expected, stretching outward with a span that seems to belong to a different category of flight. Nothing about its stance suggests speed or aggression. It appears built to endure rather than to strike. The engines are silent, but the machine does not feel dormant. It occupies space with a kind of pressure, as if the next action has already been decided. Nearby, a table holds a folded map, worn at the creases. It has been opened and closed along the same line repeatedly. The ocean dominates it. No routes are drawn, no targets marked, yet the attention it has received is unmistakable. A test officer stands apart from the activity, looking not at the aircraft but toward the far edge of the field beyond the perimeter, toward open sky. His posture suggests waiting not for departure but for confirmation. Fuel trucks arrive and remain longer than usual. The quantities being loaded exceed what most on the field consider reasonable for a routine flight. The men handling the hoses exchange brief looks, calculations made silently. Weight matters here more than anywhere else. Each leader added promises distance but threatens the ability to leave the ground at all. No one asks where the aircraft is going. The question does not need to be voiced to be understood. When the machine is mentioned, it is referred to indirectly through numbers rather than names. Range estimates, endurance projections, wind patterns at altitude, everything is conditional. The Messerschmitt Me 264 sits at the center of this careful choreography, though its name carries little weight on the field. It is treated as an experiment that should not draw attention, a project better kept technical than symbolic. Yet the caution surrounding it contradicts that modest framing. Checks are repeated. Adjustments are made that would be unnecessary for a standard operation. The aircraft size alone demands respect. It is not intimidating in the conventional sense, but it is demanding. It requires patience, precision, and an acceptance that small errors will not be forgiven once it is airborne. To an observer unfamiliar with its purpose, the Me 264 might seem inefficient. Even wasteful, it lacks the compact aggression of frontline bombers. It carries no visible urgency. And yet, everything about the preparation suggests that something untested is about to be attempted. The airfield feels like a threshold, not because a weapon is being readied, but because a limit is about to be examined. The war has already pushed machines to their edges. This one is positioned to test whether an edge truly exists. As the final checks continue and the aircraft remains motionless, the impression settles quietly. What appears oversized and impractical may, in fact, be aimed at something far beyond the horizon. By the middle years of the war, Germany's air campaign had reached a limit that could not be overcome by determination alone. It was not a shortage of pilots or aircraft, nor a lack of targets. It was distance. Bombers could strike London, Coventry, and later cities far deeper, but each operation still operated within a familiar envelope. Range charts defined what could be threatened and what could not. Beyond Europe's western edge, that envelope collapsed. Across the Atlantic lay industrial centers untouched by blackout or siren. Places where factories worked without interruption and civilian life carried a sense of removal from the fighting. Geography had become a shield more reliable than armor. Naval forces could only do so much. Surface raiders were constrained by fuel and detection. Submarines could attack shipping, but their effects were indirect and difficult to measure. They disrupted flow, not morale. They could not place a visible mark on the enemy's homeland. For air planners, this imbalance mattered. The air war had always been about visibility as much as destruction. A target unseen might as well have been untouched. Existing bombers were simply not built for oceanic reach. Their fuel capacity limited endurance. Crew fatigue imposed its own ceiling. Navigation over land relied on landmarks and radio signals that vanished once the coastline fell behind. Over open waters, small errors accumulated into irretrievable loss. Escort fighters could not accompany such flights. Any bomber sent alone would rely entirely on avoidance, hoping not to be detected rather than prepared to fight. Weather forecasting grew unreliable the farther west one looked. Winds at altitude could decide success or failure, yet could not be measured with confidence across thousands of kilometers of empty sea. Even radio contact became uncertain. The deeper an aircraft went, the more isolated it became, until it existed only as a set of assumptions in a planning room. Under those conditions, a one-way mission offered little value. If an aircraft could not return, its results could not be verified, its methods refined, or its threat repeated. The challenge then was not simply reaching North America. It was reaching it in a way that mattered operationally and psychologically. Conventional solutions failed as soon as they were scaled up. Increasing bomb load reduced range to unacceptable levels. Increasing fuel introduced new risks. Stressing engines and airframes never meant to carry such weight for such duration. Increasing size made aircraft more visible, more vulnerable, and harder to protect during takeoff and climb. Each adjustment solved one problem while worsening another. The balances that governed European bombing campaigns did not survive translation across an ocean. Intelligence assessments added another layer of pressure. Reports suggested that American confidence rested heavily on separation. The war was real, but distant. Attacks arrived through newsprint and casualty lists, not through shattered streets. This confidence shaped production priorities and public resolve. Challenging it did not require mass destruction. It required demonstration. Proof that the Atlantic was not absolute. Proof that distance alone could not guarantee safety. For planners, this shifted the question from damage to possibility. What mattered was not how much could be destroyed, but whether the barrier itself could be crossed under controlled conditions. Within that context, the Messerschmitt Me 264 began to take on meaning beyond its immediate specifications. It was not conceived to replace existing bombers or to deliver decisive blows. It existed because the problem demanded something that current doctrine could not provide. The pressure behind it was logical rather than emotional, rooted in maps, tables, and estimates that all pointed to the same conclusion. Without a machine capable of sustained, controlled transatlantic flight, the Atlantic would remain a strategic wall, shaping the war as decisively as any battlefield. The Messerschmitt Me 264 was shaped less by ambition than by constraint. Its designers did not set out to create a revolutionary aircraft. They were responding to a problem that had already been defined by distance, fuel, and endurance. The guiding principle was continuity rather than novelty. Proven structural methods were extended, not replaced. Existing systems were retained wherever possible, even when they imposed limits, because reliability mattered more than theoretical performance. Every choice reflected a preference for what was known to work over what might work better on paper. The most visible expression of this philosophy lay in the wings. They were lengthened beyond typical bomber proportions to favor lift and efficiency at cruising altitude. Maneuverability was deliberately sacrificed. The aircraft was never expected to evade fighters through agility. Instead, it was designed to remain stable for long periods, to consume fuel predictably, and to remain controllable even as weight shifted during flight. The structure was reinforced selectively, particularly in areas expected to endure constant stress over many hours. Fatigue, not combat damage, was treated as the primary threat. Weight governed every discussion. Defensive armament was considered necessary but not central. Guns and armor added mass that could not be justified unless they directly increased the aircraft's chance of completing its mission. The Me-264 was not meant to fight its way through opposition. Its survival depended on avoidance, altitude, and the assumption that it would be operating at the margins of enemy awareness. Every kilogram added to protection reduced fuel, and every reduction in fuel reduced range. These were not abstract calculations. They were worked repeatedly, revised, and argued over, often producing uncomfortable compromises. Inside the aircraft, the design emphasis shifted away from combat intensity and toward endurance. The cockpit layout reflected the expectation of long, monotonous flight rather than short bursts of action. Instruments were selected to support navigation over featureless ocean, where precision mattered more than speed of response. The crew was expected to monitor systems for hours without relief, maintaining focus as fatigue accumulated. Controls were arranged to reduce strain, and visibility was valued for its contribution to orientation rather than tactical awareness. The design philosophy assumed isolation. Engineers understood that the Me-264 would operate alone beyond the reach of escorts, ground control, or immediate rescue. This influenced decisions about redundancy. Where duplication could be added without unacceptable weight penalties, it was included. Where it could not, systems were simplified to reduce the chance of failure. Complexity was treated as a liability. Small malfunctions that could be tolerated in shorter missions became serious risks when multiplied across an ocean crossing. Range calculations were treated with caution. Tables and estimates were seen as starting points rather than guarantees. Wind, temperature, and engine behavior could alter outcomes dramatically. Designers expected that actual performance would differ from projections, and they built margins where they could. The aircraft's ungainly appearance reflected these priorities. It did not conform to established ideas of what a bomber should look like. It appeared stretched, cautious, and, in some respects, unfinished. Yet this was not accidental. The Me-264 embodied a deliberate chain of decisions shaped by the Atlantic itself. It was not optimized for combat, nor for mass production. It was built to test a possibility, to extend reach rather than firepower. Its purpose lay not in what it could destroy, but in whether it could go where no German bomber had gone before, and return under its own power, carrying proof that the journey was within reach. Flights involving the Messerschmitt Me-264 were conducted without ceremony. They were described as evaluations, endurance trials, or navigational exercises, terms chosen to keep expectations contained. On the ground, this language helped limit attention. In the air, it reflected reality. When the aircraft began its takeoff roll, the weight was immediately apparent. Acceleration was slow and the climb shallow. The Me-264 committed itself early. Once airborne, there was little room for correction. Fuel loaded on the ground determined the entire character of the flight, and every minute spent climbing reduced the margin available later. Over land, the aircraft still existed within familiar boundaries. Towns, roads, and coastlines provided reference points. Observers could imagine interception or diversion if required, but once the coastline fell behind and the ground gave way to water, the nature of the flight changed. The mission became abstract, reduced to headings, airspeed, fuel flow, and time. There were no visual confirmations, no landmarks to correct drift. Navigation depended on disciplined routine rather than momentary judgment. Small adjustments were made constantly, guided by wind estimates and engine readings that had to remain within narrow limits. For the crew, the experience was defined by monotony broken by calculation. Long periods passed with little to do but monitor instruments and maintain focus. Fatigue did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated quietly, dulling reaction and narrowing attention. Every decision carried delayed consequences. A minor course correction made early might determine whether the aircraft returned with reserves or arrived at the threshold of endurance. There were no weapons released and no targets approached closely enough to confirm their presence visually. The purpose of the flight lay in the act of crossing itself. Despite this restraint, the flights did not go unnoticed. Allied monitoring stations recorded movements that did not fit existing patterns. Endurance figures exceeded what was expected from known bomber types. Tracks suggested deliberate routing rather than weather diversion or navigational error. Reports were cautious, often qualified by uncertainty, but they circulated through planning staffs and intelligence offices. The absence of visible damage did not reduce concern. On the contrary, the lack of clear intent forced broader interpretation. Defensive discussions began that were out of proportion to what had actually occurred in the air. Within the Me-264's cockpit, such reactions were distant and abstract. The crew's immediate concern was the return. As fuel was consumed, margins narrowed. Calculations were revised repeatedly, accounting for winds that did not behave as predicted. Engines were monitored for subtle changes in temperature or vibration that could signal trouble hours later. There was little sense of achievement in the outward leg. The value of the flight depended on landing, on bringing the aircraft back intact with records that could be analyzed and compared against projections. Each successful return validated a theory rather than a tactic. It confirmed that sustained, controlled flight over ocean was possible under specific conditions. It did not prove that the aircraft could survive combat or deliver a decisive blow. It demonstrated something quieter and more troubling, that the distance separating continents could be crossed by a single aircraft operating alone. The Me-264 did not announce its presence through explosions or headlines. Its influence traveled through reports, intercepted signals, and revised estimates, leaving those responsible for defense to respond not to an attack, but to the possibility that one day there might be no warning at all. The lasting effect of the Messerschmitt Me-264 was measured less in what it did than in what it suggested. Its flights introduced a question that planners on both sides could not easily dismiss. If an aircraft could cross the Atlantic under its own power, even infrequently and under narrow conditions, then long-standing assumptions about safety and separation no longer held. Defense planning depended on probabilities, and the Me-264 altered those probabilities at their outer edge. Air defenses had been organized around expected threats. Patrol patterns, early warning systems, and resource allocations reflected what was believed to be technically feasible. The appearance of a machine capable of sustained transatlantic flight forced those beliefs to be revisited. The reaction was cautious rather than dramatic. No single report demanded immediate action, but taken together they suggested a change in the strategic landscape. Defensive discussions expanded outward. Coverage was reconsidered. Attention shifted from likely attacks to unlikely ones that could not be ruled out. The absence of an actual strike did not reduce concern. In some respects, it increased it. A threat that had not yet materialized could not be easily measured or countered. Planning had to account for intent as well as capability, and the Me-264 introduced uncertainty into both. Within Germany, the aircraft did not inspire confidence in the same way. It was regarded as a technical achievement, but also as a distraction. Resources were increasingly scarce, and demands closer to the front were relentless. Aircraft that promised immediate effect were favored over those whose value lay in possibility rather than outcome. Losses were visible and daily. In that environment, patience for long-range experiments diminished. The Me-264 required time, careful testing, and sustained investment. It competed with programs that delivered results more quickly, even if those results were costly. As conditions worsened, scrutiny replaced enthusiasm. Questions were asked about priorities rather than performance. The aircraft's ability to influence the war directly was difficult to demonstrate. Its value could be argued only in terms of potential and psychological pressure, concepts that carried less weight as the conflict turned toward survival. Gradually, the program was narrowed. Flights became less frequent. Documentation grew thinner. Secrecy followed not from fear of discovery, but from practicality. There was little reason to advertise an effort that no longer fit the immediate needs of the war. When the conflict ended, the Me-264 did not occupy a prominent place in public memory. Its story emerged in fragments, often overshadowed by weapons that had been deployed in combat and left visible scars. It lacked dramatic moments and decisive outcomes. There were no cities destroyed and no battles altered by its presence. As a result, it was easy to overlook. Yet its influence did not disappear entirely. Engineers and planners took note of what had been attempted and of what had been demonstrated under controlled conditions. Range, endurance, and the relationship between distance and perception remained relevant problems. The aircraft stood apart because it challenged an assumption rather than an enemy. It suggested that geography could no longer be relied upon as a permanent defense. Even without achieving operational status, it altered how reach was understood and how vulnerability was imagined. The Me-264 did not reshape the course of the war, but it reshaped a line of thought. It left behind an unease rooted in the realization that separation was conditional, dependent not on oceans alone, but on the limits of machines that could, under certain circumstances, cross them.